Our film begins with a true story that happened to a young Indian man in one of the Gulf countries. The film starts at the Saudi Arabian airport with two young Indian men named Najib and Hakeem standing in front of the passport officer. They try to speak with the officer, but they struggle to communicate in Arabic. Help us. After their passports are checked, they leave and start looking for their sponsor in the reception hall, but they can't find him. They remain confused, unsure of who to ask or how to proceed, until they find an Indian worker at the airport who takes their sponsor's number and calls him from the airport phone, but there's no answer. The worker tells them that today is Friday, a day off in Saudi Arabia, and that the number they called is likely the company office number, which is closed for the holiday. He reassures them that their sponsor is probably on his way and might be delayed due to traffic. Najib and Hakeem then leave the airport and wait for their sponsor. After a while, they notice someone staring at them intently, and he asks Najib if his name is Abdullah and who he is with, but Najib and Hakeem don't understand him, so the man gets angry, calls them crazy and walks away. However, he soon returns, takes the passports, and then comes back again, confirming that they are the two young men from India who have come to work for him. He then takes them to his car, and Najib and Hakeem are relieved to have finally found their sponsor. At that moment, some water, but the sponsor angrily shouts at him in Arabic, telling him not to talk too much and orders both of them to get in the car quickly. When Najib opens the car door to get in, the sponsor becomes angry again and signals for them to sit in the back with their luggage. Hakeem is upset because the car is a small pickup truck and they will have to sit in the uncovered portion. He wonders why the company they are going to work for didn't send him a proper car, especially since he just saw the Sri Lankans who were on the plane with them riding in an air-conditioned car sent by their company. But Najib tells Hakeem to keep quiet and get in the car so they can leave, and to avoid further angering the sponsor. As they travel, they think about how they will call their families to let them know they've arrived safely. Hakeem moves closer to the sponsor's window and asks him to stop somewhere with a phone so they can call their families. The sponsor angrily shouts at them again, saying the police might stop him if they don't sit properly in the car. After a long journey, Hakeem eventually falls asleep from exhaustion, and Najib covers him because the weather is cold. They finally arrive in the desert, where the sponsor gets out of the car and calls someone named Abu Khalid. He then asks Hakeem to get out of the car while telling Najib to stay inside. However, Najib follows Hakeem and tells them that he and Hakeem are supposed to stay together and that they need a phone to call their families, but the sponsor yells at him in Arabic, ordering him to get back in the car and not to leave it unless told otherwise. Najib doesn't understand a word, and Hakeem tries to speak with the sponsor and Abu Khalid in English, help us, but they don't understand him either and yell at him. Abu Khalid takes Hakeem with him and closes the door behind them. Hakeem is left shocked and devastated, as Najib was taken to one place while he was taken to another. At that moment, the sponsor hits Najib, forcing him to get into the car and stay quiet. Hakeem continues to cry and calls out to Najib, begging him not to leave him behind. Najib is then taken to another location in the desert, where the sponsor calls someone named Jazza and asks him to keep Najib until the morning. Before leaving, Najib tries to explain to Jazza that he needs a phone, but Yasser responds in Arabic saying tomorrow and telling him that he needs to sleep now. Unfortunately, Najib doesn't understand anything he says. Najib then sees an old man who looks very tired, with torn, dirty clothes and a body that seems like it hasn't seen water in years. Najib thinks that the man might be Indian like him, and he asks him if there is a phone around and tells him that he is very thirsty. The old man asks Najib if he knows why he is here and points him to a barrel of water to drink from. Najib runs to the barrel and drinks a lot of water, showing how thirsty he was. Suddenly he is startled when a camel approaches him. He steps back and looks around, asking the old man where he can sleep. The old man tells him to sleep anywhere. Najib then enters the tent where Jazza is sleeping, spreads a cloth on the ground and lies down. The scene flashes back to when Najib was in India working as a construction laborer using water from an underground source. At that time, a co-worker offers him a cigarette, telling him that it is an imported one from the Gulf brought by his brother-in-law who works in Saudi Arabia. His co-worker then offers to help Najib get a visa to the Gulf NA asks about the cost of the visa as he doesn't have any money at the moment and would have to sell his house to afford it. His co-worker suggests that Najib could mortgage the house, saying it would only take 2 months of work to make the money and pay back everything he spent on the visa. After work, Najib goes with his co-worker to meet his brother-in-law, whose name is Karuva. Najib gives Karuva the money for the visa and tells him that he sold all his belongings and the gold he had to pay for it. Karuva assures him that all the express patriots had to do the same thing in the beginning. Then asks what would happen if the visa turned out to be fake. This question angers Karuva, who tells Najib that he has sent half the people from their village to the Gulf and that the rest are eager to join the company. Najib is going to Karuva, then returns the money to Najib, saying he doesn't trust him anymore. Najib apologizes, explaining that he didn't mean to doubt him. Next we see Sinu, Najib's wife, sitting with his mother, and they are talking about Najib's upcoming journey. They discuss how he will likely eat a lot of camel meat there because Arabs love it and eat it often. His mother recalls the first time she tried camel meat when her brother Nazir returned from a trip and brought back a large amount. Najib's mother asks Sinu to give Najib the phone numbers of her brothers Nazir and Hussein, because they're also in Saudi Arabia and he might need them at some point. However, Sinu seems frustrated with her brothers because she had asked them many times to help her husband get a visa, but they ignored her and didn't help at that moment. Najib returns home and asks his mother to make him some biryani with her own hands before he leaves. He also shows concern for Sinu because she is pregnant. Then the scene shifts back to the present, where Jazza wakes up and finds Najib sleeping beside him. He gets annoyed and kicks him out of the tent, telling him in Arabic not to come into his tent again or sleep beside him, saying that his place is outside in the desert. He warns Najib that if he finds him in his tent again, he will break his legs. Najib is shocked and doesn't understand anything Yasser says, leaving him standing in the desert not knowing where to sleep. The next morning, Najib wakes up to the sound of goats and sees the old man milking a goat. The old man gives him the milk to take to the sponsor. Forgetting that Najib doesn't speak Arabic, Najib remains hungry, but the old man yells at him, telling him that the milk is for Yasser. Najib then goes to Yasser in the tent, where he finds him praying for protection from all harm. When Yasser sees Najib standing at the entrance, he gestures for him to come in, takes the milk from him, drinks it all, and then tells him in Arabic to go to the Indian man outside, as he will explain what his job will be. But Najib stays where he is, not understanding anything that was said. He tries to tell Yasser that he doesn't understand Arabic. This angers Yasser, who then tells him angrily that he doesn't want to hear him speak Hindi because he has a headache and can't tolerate too much talking in the morning. Najib becomes scared and tries to explain that he came here to work for the company and asks for help to return to the airport. However, Yasser treats him harshly, kicks him out of the tent, and tells the old man to teach him the job. At the same time, the sponsor arrives and Najib runs towards him to ask for permission to call his family. As soon as the sponsor sees him, he hands him a sack to carry. Najib tells him that he wants to call Karata because he came to work for a company and was promised his own air-conditioned room. However, the sponsor ignores him as he doesn't understand him and instructs him in Arabic to take the sack into the tent. Najib goes to the tent and places the sack inside, then looks at Yasser and the sponsor with deep sadness, thinking about how to make them understand him. Afterward, they give him a robe and a pair of shoes, but they are old and worn out. Najib tries to speak with them again, taking out his passport to show them the visa and the paper from the company he was supposed to work for, which had Kara's name and number written on it. At that moment, the sponsor tears up the paper and the passport. Najib is shocked and devastated by this action. He gathers the torn papers from the ground before they blow away and looks at them with anguish and sorrow, realizing that the sponsor and Yasser are hiding something. Later, the sponsor is sitting and baking bread with Yasser and calls out to Najib, but Najib does not respond. The sponsor waves the bread at him to come and eat, so Najib is forced to approach him to get the bread because he is extremely hungry. He grabs the bread and eats it ravenously, but then begins to choke while eating. Yasser gives him a cup of water to drink and teaches him to soak the bread in the water to soften it and avoid choking again. Afterward, Najib goes to the old man again and asks him about the road and how to escape from the desert. The old man responds in a defeated and weak voice that the road is very far and then leaves him. Najib then sits alone recalling his memories with his wife Sinu and his joy at her pregnancy and his anticipation of the child to come. He also remembers that they agreed to name the child Safia if it was a girl and Nabil if it was a boy. He recalls the day of his departure when his mother and Sao were both sad as they bid him farewell. He had asked his mother to take care of Sao as it was the first time he would be far from them, and he felt assured because they were together. When Naib comes out of his thoughts, he goes to relieve himself among the goats. When Yasser sees him using the water, he yells at him and argues, telling him that he doesn't pay for the water to use it for cleaning himself. Naib replies that he needs the water to clean himself after relieving himself, but Yasser ignores him. At that moment, the old man tells Naib that next time he will have to use sand to clean himself. Later, an Indian worker arrives at the place who works for the water company and fills Jer's water tanks every day. Najib asks him to take him with him in the car and drop him off on the road because he wants to escape from the desert but doesn't know how. At that moment, the sponsor arrives and begins to argue with the water company worker for talking to Naib, asking if Naib had requested his help to escape. The worker denies this, and at that moment the sponsor hits Najib with his ugal. Najib grabs the sponsor's hands to stop him, which infuriates the sponsor, who asks him how he dared to grab his hands to prevent him from hitting him. The sponsor then goes to the tent to get his rifle to threaten and scare Najib. Najib grabs the rifle to protect himself, but the spar strikes him on the head with it, threatening, cursing and insulting him, telling him that he will kill him and bury him in the desert. At that moment, Naib is lying on the ground and notices water flowing over the sand. This triggers memories of his time in India. He recalls jumping into the river to swim, the joyful moments he shared with Sinu as they swam together, and how happy and content they were. He also remembers his wedding day with Sinu and how they had been deeply in love. When Najib returns to reality from his memories, he begins to cry with deep sadness, calling out Sue's name loudly. Later that night, Najib sees the old man tending to the camels and feeding them. He asks him how long he has been living and working there. The old man responds with a song showing signs of madness and instability. The next morning, Yasser shouts at Naib for still being asleep. Startled, Naib realizes that Yasser wants him to milk the goats, but he doesn't know how. Nevertheless, he is forced to obey Jay's orders and tries to milk the goat, but it kicks him. At that moment, Yasser, angered, strikes the goat to calm it down so Naib can proceed. At this point, Najib inquires about the old man, noticing that he has disappeared. However, Yasser ignores him and doesn't respond. Yasser tries to inform Najib that he has other tasks to attend to, which is why he must quickly finish milking the goats or else he will be punished. Terrified, Najib attempts to milk the goats again. After a while, he notices two sheep headbutting each other and tries to intervene to calm them down, but in the process he gets kicked by the sheep as he bends down in pain. One of the sheep perceives this as a challenge, charging at him and knocking him to the ground, causing him to lose consciousness. At that moment, the kill arrives and fires a shot into the air with his rifle, causing the flock of sheep and goats to scatter. In fear, he approaches Naib, splashes water on him to wake him up and gives him a small sip of water. The kill, frustrated by the animals' escape, orders Naj to get up and gather them again, warning him that he will be deprived of water for the rest of the day if he fails. Struggling to move, Naib eventually manages to stand up, and at that moment a goat approaches him and stands beside him as if sensing his pain and suffering. The goat begins calling out to the rest of the herd, gathering him around without Nij having to chase him down. Ni feels this as a mercy from God descending upon him, and he weeps with joy, embracing the goat as he breaks down in tears. Days, months and years pass by for Nij, and his appearance changes completely. One day, by chance, Najib looks at himself in a car mirror and is shocked by how his appearance has changed due to the thick beard that has grown on his face. At that moment, the sponsor arrives and breaks the mirror to prevent Najib from looking at himself again. He mocks him, asking if he still thinks he's handsome. Naib takes a piece of the broken mirror and tries to trim his beard with it, crying bitterly, but he doesn't succeed. In that moment, he feels crushed and humiliated, and he looks up at the sky, asking God if what's happening to him is something that pleases him. He feels that life has treated him unfairly and he contemplates suicide, but just then he sees vultures feeding on a dead body. As he approaches, he realizes it's the old man's body. Overwhelmed with shock, he tries to drive the vultures away from the corpse. Afterward, he sits down and smells the jar of pickles that his mother had given him, crying and calling out to her, lamenting his torment and expressing how much he needs her. He then runs through the desert, and at the same moment the sponsor sees him and starts chasing him on his camel. The sponsor fires a shot at him, hitting him in the leg. He dismounts from the camel and violently beats Najib, kicking him and hitting him on his hands and legs, cursing and insulting him, calling him a dog. That night Najib is seen tied up among the goats and sheep, but he manages to free himself and tries to escape, only to fail due to the severe pain. He feels desperate for water. He drinks from the water the goats drink from. The next morning, Najib is walking with the goats as usual when suddenly it starts raining. He takes shelter with the goats under the rocks until the rain stops. At that moment he has a small piece of bread with him. He eats a bit of it and gives a piece to the goats to eat with him, even though the bread is very small and barely enough for him. He couldn't bear to see the goats hungry. At that moment he hears the sound of another flock of goats coming from a distance. He goes to see where the sound is coming from. He is surprised when he sees Hakeem in front of him, and he recognizes him by his voice, even though Hakeem's appearance has also changed a lot, with his hair and beard growing long like Najib's. Hakeem tells Najib that they must escape together at that moment, but Najib, feeling hopeless, tells him that he has tried to escape many times and failed. A few days later Najib sees Hakeem leaving a message for him to take, but at that moment the sponsor arrives, so Najib has to stay in place so he doesn't get caught taking the message. He waits until the sponsor leaves, then goes to take the message and reads it. Hakeem had written that the sponsor had beaten him severely for being caught talking to Najib, and that he had met an African man working with him named Ibrahim who might be able to help them escape. Najib begins to feel a glimmer of hope once again. Later Najib meets Hakeem, who is accompanied by Ibrahim. Ibrahim welcomes Najib and introduces himself. He tells Najib that in a few days their sponsor's daughter will get married and everyone will attend the wedding. This will be an unmissable opportunity to escape. On the night before the wedding we see Na locked up with the sheep while everyone else is eating and singing. At that moment the sponsor comes to Najib and gives him a piece of meat to eat. At sunrise Jazza leaves for the wedding, leaving Najib with the sheep as he won't return until the next morning. After Jazza leaves, Najib goes to open the wall water to wash and drink. He feels immense joy as he had forgotten the sensation of water touching his body. He takes off the clothes he's wearing to change into the clothes he originally came with, but finds that they've become too loose on him. He tries to find some strings to tie his pants, then feeds the camels and sheep. Before leaving he feels sadness in that moment as he bids them farewell, since they had always been by his side. Afterward he takes his bag and leaves with Hakeem and Ibrahim. As night falls Hakeem becomes very tired and thirsty. Ibrahim asks Najib to stay with Hakeem while he tries to sneak into a tent to get them some water. However, the tent owners see him, think he's a thief and shoot at him. Ibrahim manages to escape with Najib and Hakeem. The next morning we see Najib, Hakeem and Ibrahim still walking in the desert without food or water. The sun is scorching, the heat is intense and there isn't even a breeze. Hakeem asks Ibrahim if they're going in the right direction, to which Ibrahim replies that must keep walking toward the sun. Suddenly they see a dead camel in the middle of the desert, looking terrifying and eerie as its body has begun to decompose. Hakeem is filled with fear, believing that their fate will be like that of the camel due to the heat and thirst. Afterward the three of them perform ablution with sand and stand to pray, but suddenly they discover that they are in a snake den. Ibrahim quickly pulls Hakeem away and asks Najib to stay still and not move so the snakes don't notice him and bite. After a while Najib feels extremely fatigued and the ses of his feet swell due to the intense heat as he has been walking barefoot since they started. Ibrahim wraps Najib's feet with his clothes to protect him from the heat of the sand while walking. As they continue their journey Hakeem collapses from exhaustion and accuses Ibrahim of being the reason for their situation because he suggested they escape. He admits that their Life among the sheep was more merciful than what they're enduring now. At that moment Ibrahim stands up to pray, and they continue chanting prayers and supplications throughout their journey. Since Ibrahim's physical strength is greater than that of Hakeem and Najib, he manages to take care of them a little during their rest. Suddenly Hakeem begins to have hallucinations. As they walk, he sees the sand as water, grabs it and tries to eat it. Unaware of what he's doing, he collapses to the ground and blood starts to pour from his mouth. Najib becomes extremely frightened for him and tries to convince Ibrahim to help him, but Ibrahim knows that Hakeem is on the brink of death, and indeed Hakeem dies in that moment in Najib's arms. Suddenly a sandstorm hits them and Najib refuses to leave Hakeem's body. Ibrahim asks Najib to leave the body so he can carry it away from the storm, but unfortunately the storm reaches them. When the storm finally subsides, Najib remains devastated by what happened to Hakeem, feeling hopeless and unwilling to move, showing severe depression. At that moment Ibrahim forces Najib to continue their journey, knowing they must keep moving. After a while Ibrahim collapses, unable to walk due to pain in his legs. He then discovers that Najib's feet have swollen tremendously. Suddenly a lizard passes in front of them and they follow it until they find a small well surrounded by palm trees filled with dates. Ibrahim prevents Najib from drinking too much water at once, instructing him to drink it drop by drop so his body can adjust to drinking normally. Later, as they continue walking, they find a biscuit wrapper on the ground and tire tracks from a vehicle, which brings them joy as it means they are close to the road. They follow the tire tracks, but when they reach the end of the road nothing appears and they feel hopeless again. When Najib wakes up, he finds that Ibrahim has disappeared, leaving him a bottle of water from the well and a date. At that moment Najib thinks that Ibrahim must have given up and decided to commit suicide. Najib continues his journey, drinking the last drop of water from the bottle and eating the date, not knowing how much further he has to go. Suddenly he finds himself on the road, but no one stops to help him because they're scared of his appearance. He remains in this state all night, and the next morning a kind-hearted man arrives in his car, stopping as soon as he sees Najib and decides to help him. Initially Najib is frightened and terrified, but the kind man reassures him, takes him into his car and provides him with water to quench his thirst. He looks at him with sadness and sympathy, wondering how he ended up in such a condition. The kind man takes Na to the city and Najib is astonished by the help he receives, thanking the kind man with tears. Najib walks through the city streets until he meets a group of Indians who take him to their residence, help him bathe, cut his hair, shave his beard and provide him with an Indian nurse who gives him vitamins and treats his fever. One of them helps him contact his family, and when he hears their voices he breaks down crying, especially upon hearing his young son's voice. His wife tells him that their son has been named Nabil as they had agreed. Afterward Najib goes to the police station to obtain new documents and a new passport. Suddenly he sees a picture of Ibrahim posted among the missing persons. Najib then finds himself standing with a group of people detained for fleeing their sponsors. Najib feels intense fear when he sees a sponsor beating one of them violently in front of the police. His fear increases when he sees the sponsor who had previously detained him approaching and telling him that if he were the real sponsor he would have tortured him for fleeing. At that moment Najib realizes that the person he thought was his sponsor was not the real sponsor but had stolen him from the airport and pretended to be his sponsor, exploiting his lack of understanding of the language and the fact that no one would help him as he would not be understood. In that moment Najib collapses and begins to cry. Afterward Najib spent 3 months in prison until his exit permit from the country was issued. While many travelers with him had bags full of electronic devices and televisions, Najib had nothing but what was left of his life and health.